There are few moments more revealing of the human soul than when a child trembles before what he cannot name. In the eyes of little Hans, terror took the form of a horse, a creature vast, breathing, and unknowable. To the casual observer, it was a childish fear. To me, it was a window into the earliest battlefields of the unconscious, where love and rivalry first learned to disguise themselves as fear. When the father of a small boy approached me for counsel, he came burdened with the peculiar fear his son had developed, a fear of horses so intense that the child could scarcely step into the street. The boy, whom I shall call Hans, was then 5 years of age. His father, an educated man and adherent of my teachings, had carefully noted the child's remarks and dreams, believing they concealed the key to this sudden anxiety. The father's first letter to me described Hans's refusal to walk near the stables or the busy coachway beside their home. The boy declared that the horses would bite him, that their great heads and black muzzles terrified him. His father suspected the cause lay in a traumatic event. Hans had seen a horse collapse in the street and die under the weight of a heavily loaded wagon. The sight had been gruesome, and the boy had cried for hours. Yet I knew from long study of infantile neuroses that such an incident alone could not account for the persistence and specificity of his fear. The phobia had meaning. It was not random. In our first meeting, Hans spoke with that candor peculiar to children. He told me that the horses' mouths were like his father's, that their bits and blinkers reminded him of his father's mustache and spectacles. I did not, of course, suggest these associations. They arose unbidden from the child's own speech. His fear then was not of the horse itself, but of what the horse represented, the paternal figure, magnified, powerful, and menacing. Hans's father, whom I shall call Herr G., was diligent but overly involved. He served as both father and observer, a dual role that complicated the case. At my instruction, he recorded his son's daily remarks and forwarded them to me for analysis. In these transcripts, the boy's words revealed a web of unconscious conflict. Hans had begun to express tender affection toward his mother, kisses, caresses, and questions about where babies come from. When told that babies are born from the mother's body, he asked, "Do you have one too, Papa?" And upon being told no, replied triumphantly, "Then I know where babies really come from, out of Mama's tummy." It was evident that his curiosity was charged with more than mere interest. Beneath it stirred the earliest manifestations of sexual feeling. In every normal child, this instinctive curiosity about the parents becomes, for a time, directed toward the wish to possess the mother and eliminate the father. In the unconscious, this rivalry produces anxiety, guilt, and repression, the triad from which neurosis grows. In Hans's case, the fear of horses provided a mask for this forbidden struggle. The horse symbolized his father. The fear of being bitten or kicked was the displaced fear of the father's retaliation, what I have termed castration anxiety. The details confirmed the interpretation. He was frightened chiefly by horses with black muzzles and blinkers, features that directly resembled his father's face. One day, Hans confessed to his father, "I'm afraid the horse will fall down." When asked what he meant, he explained, "Because I saw one fall once, and it kicked." The fallen horse was not a memory alone. It was a condensation of images, the collapse of power, the punishment of desire, the dread of death. Thus, through the phobia, the boy's psyche had found an outlet for intolerable inner conflict. I instructed Herr G. to refrain from argument or reassurance. Fear of horses would not vanish through logic. It could only dissolve through insight. Each symptom must be traced to its origin in the unconscious wish. I told him to listen, to note, and to report without commentary. The unconscious speaks most clearly when it is not contradicted. As the days passed, Hans's remarks grew more revealing. He told his father of a dream. A big horse came into the room and bit me. When pressed for what horse, he said, it had something like Daddy's whiskers. Again, the symbolic equivalence was unmistakable. The dream was the direct expression of the repressed wish. to eliminate the rival father, and the simultaneous fear of punishment for that wish. In my correspondence with Herr G., I emphasized that such dreams were not to be dismissed as nonsense. They were the royal road to the unconscious, and through them the child's internal struggle became legible. Hans's fear of the horse was thus both confession and defense, the child's mind acknowledging the forbidden wish, even as it concealed it beneath a layer of terror. The reports I received from Herr G. during this period were of the utmost significance. Hans had begun to recount a series of dreams and fantasies which, though couched in childish terms, bore the unmistakable stamp of sexual symbolism. One morning, he told his father, a plumber came and first took away my behind with a pair of pincers, and then he gave me another one. Then he took away my whittler and gave me another one, too. At first glance, such imagery might seem absurd, even comical, but to one trained in the interpretation of dreams, its meaning was plain. The fantasy represented the wish to grow, to exchange the small and inadequate organs of childhood for those of the adult male, the father. The plumber, wielding his tools, served as the symbolic agent of transformation, a stand-in for myself as physician, perhaps, but also a surrogate for the father whose potency the boy unconsciously envied. I wrote to Herr G. that this dream revealed the structure of Hans's castration complex in its purest form. The removal and replacement of the genital organ dramatized the child's anxiety and wish combined, a desire for the father's strength, veiled by fear of the father's punishment. This, I told him, was the essence of the Oedipus complex expressed in infantile imagery. When I next spoke with Hans, I found him unusually candid. His mind, though simple, displayed an impressive symbolic capacity. If the horse falls, he told me, then I fall too. I asked him what he meant, and he replied, because the horse is big, and I am little, and Papa is big too. In these few words, the entire neurosis stood revealed: identification with the father, rivalry against him, and the fear of being crushed under his superior power. The father, meanwhile, continued to observe faithfully but not without error. He often mistook the boy's statements as literal rather than symbolic. He urged Hans to be brave, to look at the horses and see they were harmless. Such instruction, though well-meant, only deepened the repression. The symptom must never be confronted by denial. It must be listened to, interpreted, and made conscious. To tell a child that his fear is nonsense is to teach him to lie to himself. As the weeks passed, the phobia waxed and waned. There were days when Hans would walk beside a cab horse without distress, and others when he would burst into tears at the mere sight of reins or blinkers. This variability confirmed that the phobia was not fixed upon external stimuli, but upon inner associations. When the father's tone was stern, or when the boy felt jealousy toward his mother's attention, the fear of horses invariably returned. The symptom fluctuated in harmony with his emotional climate. One afternoon, Hans confided another fantasy. The horse came into my room again, he said, and I had to get on it, but it was too big. The horse's size was now not only fearful, but alluring. It invited mastery even as it threatened punishment. This ambivalence, desire and fear intertwined, lay at the heart of every neurosis I have treated. I wrote in my notes, the horse equals the father. To mount the horse equals to identify with the father. The fear of falling equals fear of punishment for forbidden identification. The dream expressed both the wish to be like the father and the dread of what that likeness might entail. During this stage, I perceived in Hans the beginnings of resolution. His symbolic language was doing its work. It allowed his unconscious conflict to speak. Whenever repression finds a voice, healing begins. Yet progress was hindered by the father's dual role. The child could not wholly unburden himself to the man who represented the very source of his fear. I therefore arranged to speak with Hans directly. I found him alert, articulate, and wholly unspoiled by suggestion. When I asked, "Why are you afraid of horses?" he answered after a pause, "Because they might bite me, like Papa once did when he played." There it was, the condensation of memory and imagination, the kernel of the complex itself. A playful moment had become, in the unconscious, a symbol of paternal aggression. The horse's teeth stood for the father's power, the bite for castration. The entire neurosis unfolded as a defense against this imagined punishment for loving his mother too much. Before we parted, I asked Hans what he thought of his mother. He smiled and said softly, "I like sitting close to her best." When I asked about his father, he hesitated and murmured, "He tells me not to." That hesitation, that pause between affection and restraint, was the sound of repression taking hold. I recall the session in which Hans, seated upon a chair much too large for him, at last began to speak freely of his dreams. There was a striking calm about him, a readiness to describe what once terrified him. "I saw a big horse," he said, "and it didn't bite. It just looked at me." I asked what he thought the horse wanted. He replied, "It wanted me to ride." That single sentence marked the turning point. To ride the horse, to master what was once feared, is the symbolic act of identification. Hans no longer fled from the paternal image. He now sought to merge with it. The transformation was unmistakable. His anxiety began to dissolve, not through discipline or persuasion, but through the unconscious recognition that the father was not the enemy, but the model of his own becoming. I explained to Herr G. that his son's fear was no longer serving its defensive purpose. The repressed wish to love the mother and replace the father had been brought into consciousness, and its accompanying anxiety had therefore lost its necessity. What the unconscious has confessed, it need no longer disguise. The symptom, once decoded, dies of exposure. In the ensuing weeks, Hans ventured again into the streets. He passed the coach horses without trembling. He even approached one, touched its flank, and later boasted of his bravery. The father, astonished, asked how he managed it. Hans answered simply, "Because horses don't bite little boys." The words were innocent, yet they concealed a profound truth. The father's authority had ceased to threaten him. In renouncing the rivalry, Hans had freed himself from fear. I wrote in my notes, "The analysis has achieved its aim, the transformation of unconscious conflict into conscious insight." The phobia had served its purpose. It had guarded the child against forbidden wishes until he was ready to acknowledge them. Once the inner danger subsided, the external symbol lost all menace. Years later, I received word from Herr G. that his son had grown into a healthy, intelligent young man. When I met Hans again at 19, he remembered nothing of his early fear, nor of the sessions that had once governed his childhood. He spoke with ease, confident and inquisitive, free of neurotic symptom. His memory of horses was entirely benign. He even rode them with pleasure. This outcome confirmed what I had long suspected, that the neuroses of childhood, when properly understood, do not doom the adult to illness. They are but the first rehearsal of psychic conflict, the early sketches of the dramas that shape us all. If met with understanding rather than repression, they resolve into normal development. In my reflections on this case, I concluded that Hans's phobia provided the first clear empirical evidence of the Oedipus complex in the child's natural environment. No laboratory could have supplied what life itself revealed through him, that love. Jealousy and fear are not learned but born within us, that every child, in his heart, repeats the ancient tragedy of Oedipus before he even learns to read its name. Thus, little Hans remains for me not a curiosity, but a revelation, proof that the architecture of the unconscious is visible even in a boy of 5, and that what begins as fear may, through insight, end as understanding.